A snow leopard picks its way along a rock ledge above the Hindu Kush at 4,000 meters, breath fogging in air so thin that a human standing in the same spot would feel dizzy within minutes. 60 meters below, a blue sheep grazes on a scree slope, unaware, secure in the ordinary assumption that nothing living at this altitude could close that distance fast enough to matter. The blue sheep is wrong. In under 4 seconds, the animal above it will cover that slope, absorb a vertical drop that would break the legs of almost any other predator on Earth, and bring down prey that outweighs it by a factor of 3. This isn't an exaggerated claim built for a thumbnail. It's a documented, repeated, biomechanically explainable behavior. And if you want to understand exactly how a 60-pound cat routinely kills animals the size of full-grown male ibex or young yaks, stick around, because the answer lives entirely in the architecture of its body. And if this is the kind of thing you find genuinely fascinating, animals doing things that shouldn't be physically possible until you understand the engineering behind them, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because there's a lot more of this coming, and you don't want to miss it. Let's start with the number that makes this whole conversation necessary. A healthy adult snow leopard weighs somewhere between 70 and 120 pounds, with most individuals in the wild sitting closer to the lower end of that range because food is scarce and the terrain burns calories faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. A blue sheep, the primary prey species across most of the snow leopard's range, weighs between 80 and 140 pounds. An adult male ibex can weigh well over 200 pounds. And in documented, camera-verified cases, snow leopards have killed and fed on domestic yaks and yak calves weighing close to 300 pounds. Animals that outweigh the predator by 4 to 1 or more. For comparison, a lion, an animal built around cooperative hunting and raw physical dominance, typically targets prey in a similar body mass ratio to its own weight, and even then usually hunts in a pride, specifically because solo lions struggle against animals substantially larger than themselves. A tiger, the largest of the big cats, generally selects prey within a comparable range to its own body mass, occasionally pushing into larger territory with species like gao, but almost always as an ambush specialist, working with the advantage of dense cover. The snow leopard does something different. It regularly, not occasionally, not as a rare outlier event, but as a core and repeated part of its hunting strategy, brings down prey 2 to 3 times its own body weight, alone, without a pride, without dense cover to hide the approach, in terrain so steep and exposed that the margin for error in the final attack is close to 0. This is not supposed to work if you're thinking about predator-prey dynamics in the way most nature documentaries present them. And the reason it does work has almost nothing to do with brute strength in the way people typically imagine it, and almost everything to do with a set of specific, quantifiable adaptations in the snow leopard's skeleton, musculature, and respiratory system that took millions of years of high-altitude selection pressure to produce. Before we get into the mechanics themselves, it's worth understanding what makes this environment so uniquely punishing, because the body of the snow leopard cannot be separated from the mountains that built it. The core range of the species runs through 12 countries across Central and South Asia, spanning the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, the Tian Shan, the Altai, and the Hindu Kush, at elevations that typically range from 3,000 to almost 5,500 meters, with confirmed sightings above 6,000 meters in some regions. At these altitudes, atmospheric oxygen concentration drops to roughly half of what it is at sea level. Temperatures regularly fall below -20 degrees Celsius in winter, and the terrain itself is defined by near-vertical rock faces, loose scree, and unstable snowpack that shifts and slides underfoot. This is not incidental scenery. It is the single most important variable in the entire story, because it means that every adaptation the snow leopard has evolved had to solve two problems simultaneously: how to move explosively and accurately across terrain that punishes any misstep with a fatal fall, and how to do that while extracting enough oxygen from air that offers roughly half of what a lowland predator takes for granted. Every other big cat on Earth hunts in an environment where oxygen is not the limiting factor. The snow leopard is the only one for whom it consistently is, and that single constraint reshaped almost every system in its body. Let's begin with the tail, because it's the most visually striking adaptation, and also, not coincidentally, the most functionally central to how a snow leopard survives its own hunting technique. A snow leopard's tail can measure up to 1 meter in length, which means it frequently accounts for close to half of the animal's total body length, nose to tail tip. No other big cat comes close to this proportion. A tiger's tail is roughly 60% of its body length. A snow leopard's is closer to 90%. And it's not just long, it's thick, covered in dense fur that can make it appear nearly as wide as the animal's own leg, and packed with fat reserves that serve as both insulation and energy storage during lean winter months when prey is scarce. But the fat storage and insulation functions, while real, are secondary to the tail's primary job, which is dynamic counterbalancing during high-speed, high-angle movement across unstable terrain. Here's what that means mechanically. When a snow leopard launches itself from a rock outcrop toward prey below, or when it's sprinting across a scree slope where the footing shifts with every step, its center of mass is constantly threatening to rotate away from its direction of travel. Any four-legged animal moving at speed across uneven ground experiences torque, rotational force that, left uncorrected, causes tumbling, loss of directional control, and in this specific terrain, potentially fatal falls. Most terrestrial mammals correct for this, primarily through limb positioning and core muscle engagement. The snow leopard has an additional correction mechanism that almost nothing else in its weight class possesses: a tail heavy and long enough to function as an active counterweight, whipped in the opposite direction of any unwanted body rotation to cancel it out in real time. Researchers who have studied high-speed footage of snow leopards navigating steep descents describe the tail moving almost independently of conscious control, snapping to counter lateral sway the instant it begins, functioning less like the decorative tail of a house cat and more like the counterweight system on a crane, constantly adjusting to keep the load, in this case the cat's own body, from tipping past the point of recovery. This is the mechanism that allows a snow leopard to make a committed, full-speed leap onto a ledge no wider than the animal's own paw, land, and immediately redirect its momentum into a second leap without pausing to regain balance. Without that tail, the margin for error in this kind of movement collapses. With it, the snow leopard can afford to commit to leaps and descents that would be suicidal for almost any other predator its size. This matters directly to the size of prey question, because it changes the entire risk calculation of an attack. A predator hunting prey larger than itself needs every advantage of terrain and positioning it can get, because a direct physical contest of strength against an animal 2 or 3 times heavier is a contest the predator loses if the prey has any opportunity to fully engage. The snow leopard's solution is not to win that contest. It's to never let the contest happen on the prey's terms. That means attacking from above, using gravity and a controlled fall as a weapon, launching an ambush from a position the prey cannot easily see coming, and cannot easily counter once it begins. Every part of that strategy depends on the predator being able to move with total confidence across terrain steep enough and exposed enough that most animals, prey, and predator alike move through it cautiously. The tail is what buys that confidence. It is, in a very literal sense, the piece of anatomy that makes the entire hunting strategy possible. Because without it, the vertical terrain that gives the snow leopard its tactical advantage would instead be a liability that limited the cat to safer, slower, more conservative movement, the kind of movement that gives prey animals time to detect the threat and escape. Now let's talk about the hind legs, because this is where the raw power of the launch itself comes from, and the numbers here are genuinely difficult to process without direct comparison. A snow leopard's hind legs are proportionally longer relative to its body than those of any other big cat, built with an exaggerated bend at the hock joint that functions essentially as a coiled spring under muscular control. When a snow leopard commits to a leap, whether that's the initial launch of an ambush or a mid-chase bound across a gap in the terrain, it can cover horizontal distances of up to 15 meters in a single jump, and it can execute vertical leaps of 6 meters or more from a standing position. To put the horizontal number in context, that's roughly the length of 1.5 school buses parked end to end, covered in a single explosive bound by an animal that weighs less than the average human adult. The vertical leap is roughly equivalent to a human standing flat-footed and jumping onto the roof of a 2-story building without a running start. The muscular architecture that produces this is built around an unusually high proportion of fast-twitch muscle fiber in the hindquarters, fiber type optimized for rapid, forceful contraction rather than sustained output. This is a direct trade-off, and it's worth understanding why the trade-off makes sense in this specific environment. Fast-twitch fiber generates enormous force quickly but fatigues rapidly and, crucially, operates efficiently even under conditions of comparatively lower oxygen availability compared to the slow-twitch fiber that powers sustained aerobic activity like long-distance running. A cheetah, by contrast, is built around a different set of trade-offs entirely, evolved for sustained high-speed pursuit across open plains at sea level or near it, where oxygen is abundant and the hunting strategy depends on outrunning prey over a sustained chase covering hundreds of meters. That strategy would be catastrophically inefficient at snow leopard altitudes, where the reduced oxygen concentration in the air makes sustained aerobic exertion punishingly expensive and recovery slow. The snow leopard's body instead is built around the opposite strategy. Minimize the duration of maximum exertion, front-load as much force as possible into the shortest possible window, and rely on stealth and positioning to make sure that short window is all that's needed. This is the biomechanical reason why snow leopard hunts, when they succeed, are almost always over within a handful of seconds of the final attack beginning. There is no version of this predator's physiology that supports a prolonged chase at altitude. The fast twitch-dominant hindquarter musculature can produce 1, maybe 2, explosive efforts before lactic acid buildup and oxygen debt force a stop. And the entire hunting strategy is built around making sure that first explosive effort is the only one required. Everything upstream of the attack, the stalking, the positioning, the patient movement into range that can take hours, exists specifically to set up a single legitimate opportunity for the hind legs to do their job once with maximum force at the moment it matters most. This is also, incidentally, why snow leopard hunting success rates, while respectable, are not extraordinarily high compared to some other predators. Camera trap and GPS collar studies conducted across Mongolia, Nepal, and the Tibetan Plateau over the past 2 decades have found that a significant proportion of stalking sequences do not end in a successful kill, in some studies less than half. The physiology that makes the successful attacks so dramatic is the same physiology that makes failed attempts costly, because a snow leopard that commits its explosive reserve of fast twitch power and misses cannot simply extend the chase the way a wolf or an African wild dog might. It has one primary shot, and the entire architecture of the hind legs is engineered around making that one shot count. The forelimbs and paws tell a related but distinct part of the story, and this is where the terrain adaptation becomes most visually obvious to anyone who's seen footage of a snow leopard moving across snow. The paws are disproportionately large relative to the animal's overall body size, functioning in a manner directly comparable to snowshoes, distributing the cat's weight across a wider surface area to prevent sinking into soft or powdery snow that would otherwise slow movement to a crawl at exactly the moments when speed and silence matter most. The paw pads themselves are covered in dense fur, which serves the dual purpose of insulating against direct contact with ice and frozen rock, and providing additional traction on surfaces that would otherwise be treacherously slick for bare pads. This combination, wide surface area plus fur-covered grip, allows the snow leopard to move across terrain conditions, fresh powder over rock, thin ice over scree, that would force most other predators into slow, careful, noisy movement, exactly the kind of movement that alerts prey and eliminates the element of surprise the entire hunting strategy depends on. The forelimbs themselves, while shorter relative to body length than the hind limbs, are exceptionally powerful and mobile at the shoulder joint, built with a degree of rotational freedom that exceeds what's found in most other cat species. This matters for two distinct reasons. The first is climbing. Snow leopards are remarkably capable at scaling near vertical rock faces, using their front paws almost like climbing tools, gripping irregularities in rock surfaces that offer only centimeters of purchase. And the shoulder mobility allows the front limbs to reach and adjust position mid-climb in ways a more rigid shoulder structure would not permit. The second reason is what happens in the final moment of an attack, when the forelimbs shift from locomotion tools to weapons. Once a snow leopard closes the distance on prey, the front legs and paws are used to grapple and destabilize the target. And this is where the disparity in relative strength becomes most important to understand, because it isn't really about the snow leopard being stronger than a 200-pound ibex in any absolute sense. It obviously isn't. It's about the snow leopard using the forelimbs, combined with body weight, delivered from an elevated launch position to disrupt the prey animal's balance and footing on terrain that is already precarious for the prey to begin with. An ibex, standing on a narrow ledge, suddenly hit by 70 to 100 pounds of predator, arriving with downward momentum from above and grappling at its shoulders and neck, doesn't need to be overpowered in a fair fight. It needs to lose its footing, and on the terrain where these hunts happen, losing footing is often fatal on its own, independent of anything the predator does afterward. The snow leopard's forelimb strength and grip exist specifically to exploit this, not to win a contest of raw strength against a much larger animal, but to convert a strength disadvantage into a balance and positioning problem that the terrain itself then finishes. This is really the central insight that explains the entire 3 times body weight phenomenon, and it's worth stating directly because it reframes everything else in the biomechanical picture. The snow leopard is not adapted to defeat larger prey through superior physical force. No adaptation in its body, examined individually, would allow it to win a straightforward strength contest against an animal 3 times its mass. What the snow leopard is adapted to do is use terrain, gravity, and the element of surprise as force multipliers. And every physical adaptation we've discussed so far, the counterbalancing tail, the explosive hindquarter power, the wide traction-optimized paws, the mobile grappling forelimbs, exists to make the predator's use of those force multipliers as efficient and reliable as possible. The mountain does a substantial portion of the work. The snow leopard's body is built to make sure it can position itself to let the mountain do that work, safely, repeatedly, and without becoming the casualty of its own strategy. Let's move to the spine, because flexibility here plays a role that's easy to overlook but genuinely essential to how the attack sequence actually unfolds in real time. Like most cats, snow leopards possess an unusually flexible spine compared to most mammals, built around a reduced and modified collarbone that doesn't rigidly connect to the rest of the skeleton the way it does in many other species, freeing up the shoulder blades to move more independently and extending the animal's stride length during full-speed movement. But the snow leopard's spinal flexibility is put to particular use in the specific context of attacking prey from an elevated position on unstable ground, because it allows for mid-air and mid-motion correction that a stiffer-spined animal simply couldn't execute. When a snow leopard launches from a ledge toward prey below, it frequently needs to adjust its trajectory mid-leap, because the footing at the launch point may shift slightly at the moment of push-off, or the prey animal may move in the split second between the beginning of the leap and the moment of impact. A rigid-spined animal committed to a ballistic trajectory has essentially no ability to correct course once airborne. The snow leopard's spine, combined again with that counterbalancing tail, allows for genuine mid-air steering, subtle but real adjustments to body orientation that can be the difference between a clean, controlled landing on target and a miss that sends the cat tumbling down a slope it just spent an hour carefully climbing. The spine's flexibility also plays a role in the moments immediately following contact with prey, when the snow leopard needs to absorb and redirect the combined momentum of its own leap and the initial resistance of a much larger, actively struggling animal. Think about the physics here for a moment. A 100-pound predator moving with velocity built from a multi-meter leap contacts a 200-pound animal that is, understandably, immediately trying to violently shake off or throw the attacker. A rigid-bodied predator, absorbing that combination of forces, its own momentum plus the prey's active resistance, risks joint damage, dislocation, or simply being thrown clear before it can secure a grip. The snow leopard's flexible spine and correspondingly flexible joint structure allow the body to absorb and dissipate that combined force across a longer, effective range of motion, similar in principle to the way a climbing rope with some elasticity absorbs a fall more safely than a rigid cable would. This is not a minor detail. It's a core survival requirement of the hunting strategy itself, because a predator that reliably injured itself every time it successfully closed on prey larger than itself would not survive long enough for natural selection to refine the strategy further. The flexibility of the spine is part of what makes repeated, sustained predation on oversized prey a viable long-term strategy, rather than a one-time gamble. Now let's talk about something almost nobody associates with predatory hunting mechanics, but that is, in the specific case of the snow leopard, absolutely central to the entire story: the respiratory and circulatory adaptations that allow explosive muscular effort to happen at all in an environment where oxygen concentration is roughly half of sea level. This is the piece of the puzzle that separates the snow leopard from every other big cat, because none of the muscular or skeletal adaptations we've discussed would matter if the animal couldn't actually deliver enough oxygen to those muscles to fuel the explosive contraction the hunting strategy depends on. Snow leopards have proportionally larger nasal cavities and nasal passages than lowland cat species, a feature shared, interestingly, with other high-altitude specialists across unrelated mammal lineages, from Tibetan antelope to certain high-altitude domestic yak breeds, which tells you this is a convergent solution to a shared environmental problem, rather than a coincidence. The enlarged nasal chamber serves two simultaneous functions. It increases the surface area available for warming and humidifying the extremely cold, dry air of high-altitude environments before that air reaches the lungs, which protects delicate lung tissue from cold-induced damage during sustained heavy breathing. and it increases the total volume of air that can be processed per breath, which matters enormously when the ambient concentration of oxygen in that air is roughly half of what a sea-level animal is working with. A snow leopard essentially needs to move a larger total volume of thinner air through its respiratory system to extract the same absolute quantity of oxygen that a lowland predator extracts more easily from a smaller volume of denser air. And the enlarged nasal architecture is a direct structural response to that requirement. The lungs and chest cavity show corresponding adaptations, with research on high-altitude mammals generally pointing toward increased lung capacity relative to body size and a higher density of the small blood vessels, capillaries, that handle the actual exchange of oxygen from inhaled air into the bloodstream. More capillary density means more surface area for gas exchange per unit of lung tissue, which partially compensates for the reduced oxygen concentration in the air being processed. The blood itself is also part of this picture. High-altitude mammals across many unrelated species, and this pattern is well documented in domestic and wild high-altitude ungulates, as well as in human populations native to places like the Andes and the Tibetan Plateau, tend to show elevated concentrations of hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells, along with structural or functional differences in how efficiently that hemoglobin binds and releases oxygen under low-pressure conditions. While the specific hematological profile of wild snow leopards is harder to study directly than that of, say, high-altitude domestic livestock, given the practical difficulty of drawing blood samples from an endangered, elusive apex predator living at 5,000 meters, the general pattern across high-altitude mammals strongly suggests the snow leopard's circulatory system has undergone parallel adaptation, allowing more efficient oxygen delivery to muscle tissue during the brief but intense demands of an explosive attack sequence. Here's why this matters so specifically to the prey size question rather than being a general fact about the species' survival. Attacking prey substantially larger than yourself requires a level of muscular force output delivered in a very short window that draws heavily and immediately on anaerobic energy pathways, the kind of energy production that doesn't require oxygen in the moment, but that creates an oxygen debt the body needs to repay afterward through heavy breathing and recovery. But even anaerobic dominant explosive effort still depends on a baseline of oxygenated blood reaching the muscle tissue in the moments before and immediately after the peak exertion, both to prime the muscle for maximum output and to begin clearing the metabolic byproducts, like lactic acid, that accumulate during the explosive effort itself, and that would otherwise force the muscle to shut down early. An animal with a poorly optimized respiratory and circulatory system operating at half of sea-level oxygen availability would find its explosive capacity meaningfully blunted, not eliminated, but reduced, compared to the same animal operating at sea level. Every adaptation we've described in the muscles and skeleton, the fast-twitch hindquarter fiber, the counterbalancing tail, the grappling forelimbs, is only as effective as the oxygen delivery system that fuels it in the moment of maximum demand. The enlarged nasal passages, the expanded lung capacity, and the specialized blood chemistry are what make sure that when the moment comes to launch a 15-meter leap and grapple a 200-pound animal on a narrow ledge 4,000 meters above sea level, the muscles doing that work actually have the fuel they need to perform anywhere near their theoretical maximum. Take away the respiratory adaptation and leave everything else the same, and you'd have an animal with the right muscles and the right skeleton attempting the right strategy in an environment that simply wouldn't let its body deliver the necessary output. The mountain habitat that makes the ambush from above strategy possible is the same habitat that would cripple that strategy without the parallel respiratory adaptation to support it. Let's talk about the killing mechanism itself, because this is where all of the preceding mechanical advantages have to convert into an actual, lethal outcome. And it's worth being precise about what actually happens biomechanically in the final seconds of a successful hunt. Like most big cats, snow leopards primarily kill through a targeted bite, typically directed at the throat or the back of the neck, designed to either sever the trachea and cause asphyxiation, or, in the case of a neck bite, to damage the spinal cord directly. What's notable about the snow leopard specifically, given the prey size disparity involved, is how much the success of this bite depends on everything that happens before it. Specifically, the destabilization achieved through the initial leap and forelimb grapple that we discussed earlier. A snow leopard, attempting to deliver a killing throat or neck bite to a fully stable, balanced, actively resisting animal 3 times its own weight, would face a genuinely difficult mechanical problem, because a large ungulate with solid footing has enormous ability to twist, buck, and use its own body mass and horn or antler structure defensively. This is precisely why the attack sequence is built the way it is, with the leap and grapple functioning specifically to compromise the prey's footing and balance before the killing bite is even attempted. Once a 200-pound ibex has lost solid footing on a steep slope, staggering or partially falling under the combined weight and momentum of the attacking cat, its ability to defensively resist a targeted bite drops dramatically, not because it's suddenly weaker in any absolute sense, but because effective defensive resistance from a large animal depends heavily on stable ground contact. And that stable ground contact is exactly what the snow leopard's attack sequence is designed to eliminate first. The jaw structure and bite force of the snow leopard, while proportionally powerful for its body size in the way that's generally true across the cat family, is not exceptional in absolute terms compared to larger cats. And this actually reinforces the broader point, rather than undermining it. Comparative studies of bite force across the felid family generally show that pound for pound, smaller cats often produce comparable or even greater bite force relative to their own body mass than larger cats do. But in absolute terms, a snow leopard's bite is nowhere near strong enough to overpower a 200-pound animal through force alone if that animal has full use of its balance, strength, and defensive capability. The killing bite works because of precise targeting, the throat or the base of the skull, applied to an animal whose ability to resist has already been critically compromised by the mechanical disruption of the initial attack. This is a recurring theme throughout every part of the snow leopard's hunting anatomy, and it's worth stating one more time because it's the single most important conceptual takeaway from all of this. The snow leopard doesn't outmuscle prey that outweighs it. It outpositions that prey, using terrain, gravity, surprise, and a precisely sequenced combination of leap, grapple, and destabilization to create a brief window in which a targeted, comparatively modest bite becomes lethal. A window that would never open if the prey animal retained full stability and defensive capability throughout the encounter. There's a broader ecological logic here that's worth pausing on, because it explains why this specific, high-risk, high-reward hunting strategy evolved at all, rather than the snow leopard simply specializing in smaller, more easily overpowered prey, the way some other predators do. The high-altitude environments where snow leopards live are defined by extreme scarcity, not just of oxygen, but of biomass generally. Prey density across most of the snow leopard's range is low compared to lower elevation ecosystems, because the harsh climate and short growing season limit the overall carrying capacity of the land for herbivores. This creates an energetic pressure that pushes strongly toward maximizing the caloric return of every successful hunt, because successful hunting opportunities themselves are relatively infrequent, given how sparsely distributed prey animals are across the vast, difficult terrain the cats must patrol. A blue sheep, or an ibex, represents a substantial caloric investment, for the ecosystem to produce, and a correspondingly substantial caloric reward if successfully killed, potentially sustaining a snow leopard for a week or more, depending on whether the kill needs to be shared or defended from scavengers. Compare this to a strategy of specializing in smaller prey, marmots, pikas, game birds, which snow leopards do also opportunistically hunt, particularly in summer months, when these smaller species are more available. Smaller prey requires proportionally more successful hunts to meet the same caloric requirement, and each individual hunt, while presumably lower risk in terms of physical danger to the predator, still requires the same investment of stalking time and energy expenditure to locate and approach in terrain this difficult and this sparsely populated with prey of any kind. Given the actual energetic economics of hunting at these altitudes, where the cat itself is burning calories at an elevated rate simply to maintain body temperature and support the oxygen processing demands of the thin air, the math strongly favors a strategy built around occasional, high-value kills of larger prey over a strategy built around frequent, low-value kills of smaller prey, provided the predator has the physical toolkit to make those larger kills reliably survivable and reasonably successful. Every adaptation we've walked through in this script is, from an evolutionary perspective, exactly that toolkit, refined over a very long period of selection pressure, specifically because the alternative, a snow leopard built like a smaller, less specialized predator, restricted to marmots and pikas, simply would not generate enough caloric return to survive and reproduce in this particular environment. It's worth taking a moment to compare this directly against how other big cats solve analogous problems, because the contrast sharpens exactly what's unique about the snow leopard's approach. Lions, as mentioned earlier, solve the large prey problem primarily through cooperation, using coordinated group hunting to physically overwhelm animals like Cape buffalo or young giraffe that no single lion could safely tackle alone, and lion prides that lose members to injury or death during exactly these kinds of dangerous large prey hunts are a well-documented cost of that strategy. Tigers generally solve the problem through raw individual size and strength, combined with dense forest or grassland cover that allows an extremely close ambush approach, minimizing the distance and time during which the prey animal has any opportunity to detect the threat and mount an effective defense or escape. Leopards, the snow leopard's closest analog among the smaller big cats, generally avoid the large prey problem almost entirely by comparison, favoring prey closer to or below their own body weight and relying heavily on tree climbing and food caching behavior to protect kills from competing predators, rather than on any specialized capacity to take down oversized prey in the first place. The snow leopard's solution, terrain weaponized ambush, enabled by an extraordinarily specialized combination of counterbalancing tail, explosive hindquarter power, flexible spine, and high-altitude adapted respiratory system, exists because none of the other strategies were available to it. Solo hunting in low-density, low-visibility mountain terrain rules out the cooperative group strategy that works for lions, because prey density is simply too low to reliably support multiple cats hunting the same territory, and the terrain itself often makes coordinated group approaches on a single target mechanically difficult, given how narrow and exposed most stalking routes are. Dense ambush cover, of the kind tigers rely on essentially, doesn't exist above the tree line, where most snow leopard hunting happens, on open rock and scree slopes, where visual concealment has to come from camouflage and patience rather than vegetation. And restricting itself to smaller prey, the leopard's general strategy simply doesn't generate enough caloric return to sustain a predator in an environment this sparse and this energetically demanding. What emerged instead, over a very long period of evolutionary refinement, is a genuinely unique solution among the big cats. a predator that turns the very terrain that makes this environment so hostile to almost everything else living in it into its single greatest tactical weapon, using vertical drops and unstable footing as force multipliers that let a relatively small, comparatively lightweight cat repeatedly and successfully bring down animals 2 to 3 times its own body weight, not through any single dominant adaptation, but through an integrated system in which the tail, the legs, the spine, the paws, and the respiratory architecture all function together as parts of a single, tightly coordinated mechanism. This integration point deserves emphasis before wrapping up, because it's easy, having walked through each adaptation individually, to come away thinking of them as a checklist of separate features rather than what they actually are, which is a single, coherent system where removing any one component would significantly degrade the function of the others. The tail, without the explosive hindquarter power to generate the destabilizing terrain movement in the first place, would have far less rotational force to correct. The hindquarter power, without the flexible spine to absorb and redirect the resulting impact forces, would risk structural injury on nearly every successful attack. The flexible spine and grappling forelimbs, without the respiratory system to fuel the muscular output involved, would be attempting a physical task the body simply couldn't power adequately in oxygen-poor air. And none of it matters without the wide, fur-padded paws providing the traction and weight distribution needed to even reach the attack position across snow and ice-covered terrain in total silence. Because a stalking approach detected too early gives the prey animal time to reach more stable, more defensible ground before the attack ever begins. At which point, every other adaptation in this list becomes irrelevant, because the single most important variable in whether a hunt against oversized prey succeeds is whether the element of surprise, the terrain advantage, and the compromised footing of the target can all be achieved simultaneously in that first, decisive moment of contact. Researchers who study this species, primarily through GPS collar data and an increasingly sophisticated network of camera traps positioned along known travel corridors across the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, and the mountain ranges of Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan, have spent decades reconstructing exactly this sequence, piecing together kill sites, tracking blood trails and drag marks, and in a smaller but growing number of cases, capturing actual video footage of full hunting sequences. What emerges consistently from that body of research is precisely the picture just described: a predator whose success against oversized prey depends far less on any single spectacular physical trait and far more on the precise, practiced coordination of several traits working in sequence, executed by an animal that has, through generations of natural selection in one of the most physically demanding environments on the planet, become extraordinarily good at exploiting a very narrow, very specific window of opportunity that the mountains themselves provide. There's also something worth saying about what happens to this hunting strategy as the environment around it changes, because it's not a static picture, and understanding the mechanics of the hunt is incomplete without understanding the pressures currently acting on it. Snow leopard habitat across virtually its entire range is under increasing pressure from a combination of climate change, which is altering vegetation zones, and in turn, the distribution and abundance of prey species like blue sheep and ibex that depend on specific alpine grazing conditions. And expanding human presence in the form of livestock grazing, infrastructure development, and in some regions, mining and road construction that fragments the connected mountain corridors the species depends on for both hunting territory and genetic exchange between populations. Camera trap studies across multiple range countries have documented an increasing overlap between snow leopard hunting behavior and domestic livestock, similar in structural pattern to the human-wildlife conflict dynamics documented in other large predator species elsewhere in the world. where a shrinking or altered prey base pushes predators toward increased reliance on domestic animals, which in turn increases conflict with the herding communities who share this landscape and depend on those same livestock for their livelihood. This dynamic doesn't change the fundamental biomechanics we've spent this entire script describing. The tail, the legs, the spine, the lungs still function exactly the same way, whether the target is a wild blue sheep or a domestic yak calf. But it does mean that the ecological context in which those adaptations get deployed is shifting, with real consequences both for snow leopard population stability, since livestock predation frequently results in retaliatory killing by herders in regions without adequate compensation or livestock protection programs, and for the broader question of whether the specific prey base that shaped these adaptations over evolutionary time will remain available in anything like its historical abundance as the alpine ecosystems across Central Asia continue to warm and shift over the coming decades. None of this diminishes what's genuinely remarkable about the animal itself, and it's worth closing on that note, rather than on the conservation concerns, real as they are. What we've walked through here, the meter-long counterbalancing tail, the 15-meter horizontal leap powered by fast twitch-dominant hindquarter muscle, the flexible spine allowing mid-air trajectory correction and post-impact force absorption, the oversized snowshoe paws providing silent traction across ice and powder, the enlarged nasal cavities and expanded lung capacity solving an oxygen delivery problem that no other big cat on Earth has to contend with at anything like the same severity, is a genuinely extraordinary integrated solution to one of the more difficult problems in the entire predator kingdom. How does a mid-sized cat, alone, without the cooperative advantage of a pride, without the raw mass advantage of a tiger, without the dense ambush cover available to a leopard, reliably and repeatedly kill animals 2 to 3 times its own body weight, in one of the most physically punishing environments any mammal has ever adapted to survive in, let alone hunt successfully in? The answer isn't one impressive trait. It's an entire body built, piece by piece, joint by joint, muscle fiber by muscle fiber, nasal passage by nasal passage, around a single evolutionary bet, that in this specific terrain, under these specific conditions, the mountain itself could be turned into a weapon if the animal wielding it had exactly the right physical toolkit to use it. Over an evolutionary timescale stretching back millions of years, the snow leopard became that animal, and every solo hunt that ends successfully on a scree slope 4,000 meters up is, in a very real sense, that entire evolutionary bet paying off one more time.